Well, for our Veriton viewers and listeners, it's Maynard, Mike, and Deborah Byers here with a really exciting show. We're going to talk to our friend Roger Pilkey. If you don't know Roger, I'm guessing most of you do, but if you don't, look for him publishing under the title The Honest Broker. We got to know Roger through friends many years ago, but I think one of the observations we've had coming up on, Mike, I'm thinking we're coming up on our fourth year at Veriton, is if you think energy is complicated, just hold on to your hat, because climate is even more complicated. And Roger's a great friend we've found through the years to call on to help us understand all the various aspects of climate science. We only know a little of what we'd like to know, but we're pleased to have friends like Roger Pilkey to help us understand it. Roger, welcome to COBT. We're so glad you're joining us.
Thanks, Maynard. It's great to be with all you guys.
Well, it probably goes without saying, one of the things we'll be talking about today is the DOE's new report on greenhouse gases and their effects, and what we should be thinking and doing about all that. Deborah Byers, I mentioned, is a senior advisor with us. She's a former senior partner with Ernst & Young and has been a tremendous help to all of us at Veriton thinking about policy and policy implications over the years. So Deborah, let me welcome you as a special guest host today.
Thanks for including me in this discussion.
No, we're excited about it. Well, Mike, you always get us going and tell us what's happening in the world. How is it today?
Yeah, markets are up a little bit today. I mean, I just think everyone's looking at all these economic reports that come out this week, and it can really kind of determine where interest rates go here 2 weeks out at the September 17th FOMC meeting. But, 10-year bond yields right around 4% right now. This coming week, we're going to basically have a big economic week. Like I said already, you're going to have CPI, PPI, initial jobless claims. And that will set the tone for the bond market and probably the equity markets as well. Right now, as you know, most people expect, the Fed to cut at the September 17th meeting by 25 basis points, and maybe 2 more cuts at that by year end. Now, if these numbers do come in pretty weak, then you're going to see, the 10-year bond yield is going to probably plunge, and there's going to be more momentum to say, hey, maybe it's not going to be a 25 basis point cut at the 17th meeting. Maybe it's something like 50 basis points. So that's kind of where we are with the 10 yield. I'd say from the S&P, S&P 500, we've been talking about this for the last week about NVIDIA and all this other stuff, but earnings are essentially over. And so the markets now are basically in the month of September. And all I'd say is the month of September is a truly bad month for the market, the worst month for markets. Over the last 5 years, the average decline in the S&P 500 during the month of September is a little over 4%, and that's way exceeding every other month. So September is a dangerous month, so something to watch out for, especially with all these things going on with tariffs, with the interest rate cuts and stuff of that nature. So we'll see how things play out there. I'd say the interesting thing that happened in the commodity markets over the weekend was OPEC raising production again. I think most people, expected they might raise production. Well, not most people. Some expected they might raise production at this meeting. Remember, they already have 2.2 million barrels per day of stated production increases. There's only probably about 1.5 million of that on the water, probably 70 to 75% of that. So they're adding another 135,000 barrels a day. And that's really from the 1.65 million barrels a day of cuts that they announced in April of 2023. And so what we have right now is a market, you would expect that oil prices would have maybe declined over the weekend. They actually went up over the weekend on that news. And I think the reason why is there was a little bit of a built-in momentum there that they might actually raise prices, raise production levels, but it wasn't as big as expected. Now, a couple things I think this says, one, I mean, people are getting really, really bearish. And when I mean really bearish, I'm talking about commodity shops. And I'm talking about the IA. A lot of these people are talking about 1 million to 2 million barrels a day of surplus oil capacity in 2026. At Veriton, we're not as bearish as that, but that's where we are right now. I think people are looking at OPEC saying they're going after market share. They're looking at basically balances next year being in surplus. And so we're just going to have to see how things play out right now. But clearly, people are on the bearish side. We're still in the low 60s in WTI, and so we'll see where we go from here. I'd say the one notable thing that I would say that I saw over the weekend and it's kind of surprising me is what's going on in Argentina. Right, you have Milei's ruling party in Argentina in some, sort of provincial elections, had some defeats, and so you're seeing today bonds, commodities, currencies, and equities really getting hit in that area. And from an equity standpoint, their market's down about 13% on Monday, and so clearly some concern there that a lot of this momentum that we've seen in Argentina, maybe it's going to be have to be pulled back a little bit. So I just want to mention that. And the last thing I'd say is, I think most of we had Betty Jiang last week, and she was our, was a Barclays E&P analyst, and we were talking about we were going to go to Barclays last week, and here are a few overriding themes that we saw from there. I think that basically electricity, the need for speed, getting any electricity on as quickly as possible, big overriding issue. I think the other thing is this big gap between bearish oil sentiment and bullish gas sentiment into 2026. That has been really wide, and that is now starting to come in. And I would say that by mid 2026, I think people are constructive on both commodities. That was something that we picked up at the conference. And the last thing we'd probably say is that there is a growing appetite for geothermal. We saw a lot of investors there. We saw a lot of panels with geothermal. Those meetings were packed. And so watch out for geothermal. It's becoming impactful. People have got an appetite for it. So we'll turn back to you, Maynard.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Well, Deborah, I was just thinking before we jump in with Roger, you might have a couple of thoughts for us. You do a lot of great work, not just with us, but with the Baker Institute, with Scott Tinker. You love this stuff. I know, because I hear from you all the time. We have a lot of fun. But anything on your mind as we turn to Roger to start today's discussion?
Well, I would say this is really a positive development, even though there probably is, the pockets of negative discussion in social media in particular. But when people get face to face and really start looking at the research, the body of research that's out there, it has been ongoing for the last 2 decades. This is a good debate to have, and the DOE report really has jump-started the debate that we needed to have. And I think, Roger, I'm just really excited to have you on, because we really want to talk about what are the outcomes that we were trying to achieve with some of the policies, and have we been successful? And should we relook at both the underpinning analysis on the science side and the research? Where should we be, putting tax dollars to get the outcomes that we want for our future? So whether it's the energy policy, whether it's environmental policy. So I think this is very good, and everyone should kind of go at this with a very open mind and put aside the emotion and passion and advocacy and really look at the facts.
Well, as you know, Deborah, we couldn't agree more. And Roger, I mentioned it in the lead-in. Our experience getting to know you has been a blessing. You're very thoughtful, and you've gone through so much you've done so much work over the years. And to Deborah's point, this is a super important issue, and pausing to understand things and to debate them and to think about our options. It's almost like the fundamental, one of the core reasons we started Veritin. So Roger, thank you for joining. So this DOE report, maybe we'll just jump in right there. Give us a little bit of background on it from your perspective. Obviously we had a change in administration. We've had a change in energy thinking. This group was convened to think about these issues, and now there's a report that shares some new thinking, I guess you'd say. And then there's to Deborah's point, there's people who don't think it was done as well as it should have been, or have complaints. But why don't you I'll get out of the way and ask you to talk a little bit about it from your perspective, because I know it's obviously big news in climate science.
Yeah, first let me just say thanks for those gracious and kind remarks, Maynard. With comments like that, you're never going to succeed on Twitter talking about climate science. Far too nice and gracious, but thank you. On this issue and the DOE report, I think if I could just take a minute to kind of go through the longer history of where did this come from? Why is DOE releasing a report on climate science now? And in thinking about how to frame this, I'm going to start in 1955. 1955 is the year that the U.S. Congress first passed federal legislation regulating pollution. That's when it started. And flash forward to through the 1960s, there was a lot of issues and debates and problems, and things really solidified in 1970 with the Clean Air Act amendments. And most people will be familiar with the Clean Air Act for regulation of criteria pollutants, smog generally. That act was amended in 1977, had a major revision. And then again in 1990, when they added a new section for chlorofluorocarbons, ozone depleting substances. In the late 1990s, a number of advocacy groups and states came together to sue EPA under the Clean Air Act. And they said, you should be regulating carbon dioxide. It's a pollutant. It causes changes in climate. And EPA's response during that time, under the Bush administration in the early 2000s, was that we don't think it is a pollutant. We don't think it's covered by the Clean Air Act. And so that case made its way all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 2007, Massachusetts versus EPA, in a narrow decision, 5-4, the majority decided that carbon dioxide is in fact a pollutant. And the main reason for that is that the Clean Air Act is written so broadly that pretty much anything could be a pollutant. Justice Scalia, in his dissent, said frisbees and flatulence would fall under that definition, and he was not wrong. Lest anyone think that issue will be reopened, both the Inflation Reduction Act, which was championed and led by Democrats, classified CO2 as a pollutant, and so too did the One Big Beautiful Bill, championed by Republicans, also classified CO2 as a pollutant. So that issue probably won't be revisited. After the Supreme Court case, then what followed was the Bush administration only had a few months left, and so they didn't do anything on carbon dioxide. But immediately, when the Obama administration came in, they issued what's called an endangerment finding. An endangerment finding is something that falls under the Clean Air Act and said that carbon dioxide presents risks of harm to U.S. citizens and therefore should be regulated. So when, flash forward, we get to the Trump administration, and the Trump administration has proposed to rescind or reconsider that endangerment finding from 2009. In parallel with that proposal to rescind it, the DOE issued this climate science report, and it was written by five scientists who have, in all frankness, been on the outside of the climate science community looking in. That's not to diminish their outstanding career track record and publication record, but they argue that there are some important issues that have been overlooked in mainstream published assessments in climate science. And we can talk about how significant is science for the endangerment finding. Chris Wright, Secretary of Energy, has really had this as an issue since long before he became a part of the cabinet. He's raised questions about why is it that climate science tends to exclude certain views. And so what has happened is this new report, by virtue of being a U.S. government report, has opened up both the needed, as Deborah says, a needed scientific discussion, but also a messy, sometimes nasty food fight that takes place on social media and the mainstream media. And we're seeing a discussion of climate science today, probably unlike anything we've seen in a long time.
Can I ask you, Roger, because we know from being around you, you have invested much time and energy, much of your professional career in climate science and understanding all the aspects of it. I guess the most frustrating thing you might say about it as a topic is, for some reason, as important as it is, it doesn't get the debate. It doesn't get the point counterpoint. It doesn't get the, well, no, I think this, or I think that, or I think this would be a better solution. It sort of starts on second base as a discussion. And I'm just kind of culturally, I think this gets to Deborah's point, but culturally, why do you think that is? And are we entering a period where we can at least raise our hands and ask some questions and understand this a little bit better.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's been a long time ago. 30 years ago, I wrote my PhD on how to shape institutions of climate research so that the research they produce is most useful to policymakers. And when you have any topic as complicated as climate change, of course we're going to ask questions. And of course we're going to try to understand uncertainties and areas of ignorance. For a long time, the theory of change behind those advocating for action on climate change, and I'm one of them, carbon dioxide affects the climate and we should definitely be paying attention to it. But the theory of change was that, well, if everyone thinks the same thing about the science, then that'll make the politics and policy a lot easier. And there has been an effort to enforce views that are, more black and white. So climate advocates will say, the science is settled. There's no questions. Anyone who asks questions must be a bad guy. And, to be honest, there's folks on the right. James Inhofe, the late James Inhofe, showed up on the Senate floor with a snowball and said, I got a snowball in Washington, D.C. How can there be climate change? So a lot of science is colored in shades of gray, not black and white. And that's okay because, as we've talked about often before, a lot of the policies related to carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions, as well as adapting to climate extremes, don't depend on having a unified, universal view of the science. But unfortunately, the community has fallen into this trap of penalizing those who raise questions or are perceived to be inconvenient. And the last thing I'll say is, this has fallen out, as many things do in 2025, along very predictable partisan lines. Most people are in the middle on these issues, but the elite debate is very much, at this point, MAGA versus progressives, and that's not healthy.
One thing I just want to interject is, we're really talking about this from the standpoint of the US-centric view and, frankly, the European view. And research for the last 40 years, as you say, real strong advocacy that this is the single view that everyone should sort of sign on to. And, to give them some benefit of the doubt, it was because they were convinced that this was an emergency, it was a crisis, and any sort of doubt would slow down progress towards the solution, that the technical solutions that were being put forth. But if we kind of go outside of the Western-centric view, there's other research that's been done, whether it's Russia or China or the global South, that one, they probably haven't paid a lot of attention to this issue because they're just trying to figure out how to continue the economic development of their countries. Arjun Murty, one of our great partners here, talks a lot about the rest of the sort of 7 billion people. And so what is the state of that research? Because, this can't just be a singular, here's the Western-centric view.
Yeah, and it's not just Western-centric, but it's Western-centric mediated through what are called integrated assessment models. These are models of the economy and models of climate change and energy systems. And I do think there has been a significant amount of unreality in climate advocacy in the West, whether it's Europe or the US, about what it takes to actually turn the global energy system from being fossil fuel dependent, which the world is still 85% dependent on fossil fuels, and to move to something else. And there are these competing demands. India, China, Vietnam, eventually most of Africa are going to want to have energy, access to energy services that we take for granted every single day. And the world's going to consume massive amounts of energy. So understanding that the time frame, and it's, the analogy I often use is increasing human lifespan. If you go back 100 years and the average human lifespan on this planet was less than 40 years. And now that's, in some places that's doubled. But that's not something that you change overnight. You change that over many decades. And so there have been calls to cut fossil fuel consumption in half by 2030, which is 4.5 years from now, or to eliminate it altogether by 2050. And just as a mathematical proposition, we don't know how to do that. We do know how to decarbonize the economy. And actually, there are places around the world where the insatiable demand for energy is motivating innovation. China is the true all of the above energy country. They're adding more solar, more wind, more geothermal, more natural gas, more coal, because they need the energy. And in doing so, it turns out that implementation and deployment of energy systems, whether it's electric cars on the consumption end, or solar panels, that's a great stimulus to innovation. So I think I do see it both ways, that yes, there's a lot of demand growth outside the U.S. and Europe, but at the same time, there's also a lot of innovation taking place.
Roger, could you comment when you think about this from I guess a political standpoint, or perhaps more just at the voter level? This report, as you tell that history, it sounds like one of the key features of the report is it now sets the basis to reverse the endangerment finding. That it's almost like it's an internal Washington policy type thing, very much an inside the beltway thing. But when you think about this, I think as we run into people around the world thinking about climate, thinking about energy, thinking about issues, if you're in Europe or California, obviously people think differently than if you're in Texas, just to pick, three places. Can the report, and I know you do this all the time, but how do we take climate understanding and sophistication and nuance to the world, so that, because there are some people on the street, right? They've been told one thing and they're on this side, and there's other people who've been told one thing, they're on this side, and neither polarized position is helpful. We need this sophistication. Will the report eventually be used that way, or how do you think about the purpose of it? Just give us your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, this gets down into some of the legal weeds. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a policy guy. But when I look at the Clean Air Act and how it's been interpreted in court cases and in practice, the scientific bar to exceed for a finding of endangerment is incredibly low. And I published a piece yesterday in which I said, just take the first paragraph from the new DOE report. It clears that bar. So, the first thing I would say is that the advocates for keeping the endangerment finding should take the win. Yeah, that's great. We disagree about some of the particulars and what's down in the weeds, but when it comes to the law, it's a very low bar to exceed. That said, the DOE report does raise some interesting issues, and I do think some of the overheated reaction to it, the kind of freak out that we've seen among some in the media and some scientists, is precisely because there are some very important things in there that we should be considering that unfortunately they don't want to talk about. One of them, and we've talked about this on a number of occasions, is that the scenarios of future energy consumption and carbon dioxide that we thought 2 decades ago were where we were headed, with very large implications for climate change. Those scenarios are very much moderated today. There is not a sense that the world is headed for 4 or 5 degrees of climate change as the central estimate. It's 2.5 degrees. That's still problematic and will require the world to do some important things in response. But climate change is more of a situation to be managed than the apocalypse. And this report lays that out fairly clearly. I did have some critical comments that they could have been even stronger on that point. But if your theory of change is that we have to scare everyone in order to motivate action, someone coming in and saying, oh, well, things aren't as scary as we used to think, politically, that becomes problematic scientifically. And this is how the science very quickly becomes political. The other issue I'll raise is people, particularly the media, but a lot of advocates like to use extreme weather events to advocate for changes in energy policy, as if changing energy policy can prevent floods or hurricanes and drought. And when you take a look at the actual science, this is the science of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which the new DOE report cites quite a bit of. There have been and there will be implications for extremes, but they are, again, much less muted than you might guess if you're turning on your 6 o'clock news.
Do you think this report, and we'd be up for helping however we can help, will this report spur discussion? Are we going to see some positive debates? Could we see some? In fact, it was suggested to me by a friend, Roger, that we should host one of these things, and I suppose we'd be up for it. But how do you forecast what happens from here? Are we going to get some good debate, or is this just going to go into the file and we're going to continue to stay in our corners and not have a robust discussion here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way you frame that is I think exactly right. If people are looking for it, there's plenty of debates about the details of science. Have hurricanes become more frequent? Is drought more or less common in the American Southwest? I mean, there's plenty of places you can go to have those sorts of debates. I think far more important is that, and this goes for any area of science. It could be COVID, it could be climate science, but that people who are the self-described experts need to demonstrate to the broad public, and in this country we have a public that is fractured on partisan lines, that they are open, they're willing to have discussions, they're willing to engage in constructive disagreements. It's not important that everybody agree or this side or that side wins a particular debate, but our experts have become themselves fractured along partisan or ideological lines. So the more the climate science community can do to show, hey, we're a big tent. There's a lot of credentialed experts out there. Some of them have views that differ from others. Great, let's have that discussion. Let's get in front of the public. Instead, if you go on Twitter or Blue Sky or Facebook, what you'll see is scientists acting like they're in junior high school, screaming at each other, and that's not a way to build trust.
Can I just throw in one more question, Roger, while we're right here on this issue, which is, and this is something we noticed, the world is so specialized today. Like, to understand various features of life, climate science would be one of them. You should pretty much do that completely, which may mean, you don't have the other perspectives that might be helpful to thinking about and this would apply to anything. Anybody could say this, but how do we democratize climate science when it is so complicated, right? This is from an outsider's perspective. All the scenarios are complicated, the models are complicated, the variables are complicated, the data, the analysis, it's a very intimidating field. So are we by default, because you're one of the few people that has waded into it and then come back out and said, let me try to tell you the rest of you what's going on, and I welcome debate. How as a society have we gotten like that, where the specialists, there have been other issues like this, where the specialists dominate the topic and the rest of us have a hard time getting in? Is there something cultural that needs to be addressed here? Not to make the problem harder, but.
No, I think there, we see big problems nationally with respect to universities, with respect to expertise, public trust in public health experts. The Trump administration is, savaging CDC. There are huge issues here. Specifically, when it comes to climate, I think it's important that people realize that science really matters. I'm going to give you a very specific example. I'm sitting in Texas as we record this, and in 2021 there was the big freeze that occurred, caused massive power outages, and people argued about, was that caused by climate change or not? That's not the important question. The important question was, why was it that ERCOT was using a historical data set that only went back 10 years to assess weather variability and weather change? If you go back to 1989, there was a very similar freeze. And if Texas was prepared for 1989, they probably would have been prepared for 2021. And so climate is about much more than climate change and climate politics. And when I was younger, there used to be old school climatologists who, had graph paper and reams of data, looking at historical variability, we can go a long way to making ourselves more resilient to climate extremes simply by understanding the past a lot better and understanding what's possible. And so I do think that the climate science community has kind of gotten into a cul-de-sac of these debates over climate change, which really, in many cases, aren't particularly relevant to what we decide to do in energy policy and what we decide to do in our communities and in our businesses to harden ourselves to what can be very impactful climate extremes.
Hey, Roger, one of the key findings, I want to just kind of, say it right here and then ask you a question. And one of the findings was overly aggressive policies aimed at reducing emissions could do more harm than good by hiking the cost of energy and degrading the reliability. And I think that's really important, at least at this point, more so than 2, 3, 5 years ago. And the reason why we're seeing it play out right now with data centers, electricity growth in the US, we're seeing MISO prices spike, we're seeing PGM prices spike. And so that's going to continue to be a nudge on the system. But we also, Goldman Sachs just this week put out a paper that basically said European electricity demand has been flat to negative, is actually going to be growing 1 to 2 or 3%, 1.5–2% over the next couple of years. So they're going to be facing these electricity grid issues as well. And I guess my question, and then we're going to see California next week is probably going to be, from a regulatory standpoint, it's going to be voting on legislation to maybe get permits and stuff. But it seems like everything's moving the opposite direction just at the right time, because we're going to need this. We're going to need politicians to have some leeway to say, you know what, the bigger issue right now is not the climate issue. The bigger issue is cheap, competitive, and reliable electricity. Maybe some thoughts there about maybe the timing of this being pretty ideal, for politicians to kind of have a exit ramp.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. On climate policy specifically, the overriding theory for a long time was that in order to motivate some sort of a move away from fossil fuels towards alternatives, we need to make energy more expensive, fossil energy in particular. And so there have been a lot of policies proposed and implemented focused on supply side restrictions. Everyone's probably heard, just keep it in the ground, or no Keystone XL, or to block the development of fossil fuel infrastructure with the idea of creating a shadow price on carbon. If you go to your economics 101 class, if you make something more expensive, people are going to use less of it. And so from an economic standpoint, that's a sound theory. If you go across campus to your political science department, you're going to realize people don't like higher price energy. They don't like it at all. They're going to, if you're in France, they're going to put on their yellow vests and shut down cities. And if you're in many countries, you're going to vote for the politician who says, I'm going to promise you lower priced energy. So I do think there was a political failure there. So I'm at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and my colleague Rui Teixeira and I did a poll right before the election of what Americans think about climate and energy. And it's all posted, all the crosstabs. You can take a look at it. And the number one thing that everyone agrees with, everyone, it doesn't matter who they vote for, they want reliable, secure, low-cost energy, whether it's gasoline at the pump or their electricity bill. And so this is something that I think, there's really no politician anywhere that I've come across in the world who gets elected to office promising to hike people's bills. It's just not going to work. And so I do think there's this growing realization. And in the United States, it was difficult for a while because there was, with respect to electricity, it was flatlined for a while, a decade or more. And so there wasn't the increasing demand. And it turns out that demand is, the mother of invention, that, we got to get busy. I knew things had changed when I think it was Microsoft announced that they were going to, restart 3 Mile Island. They didn't even give it a new name, a new cool name. They just stuck with the old, legacy name. The views on nuclear have turned significantly. In our poll, we found that most Americans support natural gas. Coal is not popular. Wind is not popular. Solar is pretty popular. Natural gas is popular, and nuclear is increasing in its popularity. So when President Trump says, energy dominance, or President Obama said all of the above. These are the sort of things that resonate politically, and I do think I was at the Abundance Conference in Washington D.C. recently and got to see a Democrat and Republican from the House sitting on the stage, completely in agreement about the need for increasing energy resources across the country in an all of the above fashion. So I do think things have changed quite a bit. It doesn't mean the climate agenda is going to go away. What it does mean is that climate advocates are going to have to rethink their theory of change for a world in which energy is growing. And the fact that we're going to be relying on fossil fuels for many, many decades into the future, natural gas has, I think, a very bright future. And if I'm in charge and I get to implement a policy to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, I'd be pushing to reduce the dirtiest coal plants in the world. They're not in the United States, but the dirtiest coal plants in the world with natural gas. And if it's exported from the U.S., so much the better, because as everybody knows, natural gas is half as carbon intensive as coal.
So, Roger, I mean, following on that point, I know a couple of years ago you were generous with us, and you and I did a panel for the Veritan Summit, and I think one of the charts you put up really got a lot of attention, which was, in the U.S., for example, we've had solar tax incentives since 1978. So we've been on this journey of sort of the preferred solution to decarbonize has been renewables, at least on the power grid side. Yeah. And so that's a long time. I mean, that's like 50, I'm starting to get old. That's like 50 years, right? So, and the rest of the world is trying to catch up. But you put a chart up that says, okay, all of this effort that we've had and all of this is a crisis. We got to do it right now, net zero. Emissions have not declined. And so put aside, all of the debate on the science, which absolutely should happen, because I think that will inform, well, what are the good pathways? Is it really resilience here? Is it, a little bit of a different type of energy resource here? But so that needs to happen clearly. But when you look at the outcome of the policies that have been put forward as the solution, and we find that it's not really achieving that, I mean, that ought to get some more debate, right? I mean, I didn't see any of those discussions because I know the report was truly around endangerment. But how do you see that conversation really needing to come to the forefront? And really, your chart, you ought to put that back up.
Yeah. So for me, the most interesting time series in all of climate science and climate policy for me is the rate of decarbonization. So decarbonization of the economy refers to the amount of CO2 emitted per dollar of GDP. And if you look at that time series, and we have good data back to the 1960s, if you look at it globally and you look at it in the United States, it's a straight line. If we were improving the decarbonization of the economy, there would be an inflection point in that time series. So what that tells me is that for all of the talk, all the debates, all the discussion, all the policies, we haven't fundamentally altered the rate of decarbonization. If we are going to deeply decarbonize, that rate needs to speed up. And if you just look at the math, the simple math of decarbonizing the economy, historically, what has driven that are gains in efficiency and the changing, sectoral makeup of the economy. Our economy is much less carbon intensive than it used to be. But reducing carbon intensity by itself doesn't necessarily reduce emissions. The good news is global emissions have been pretty much flatlined, plateaued within the margin of error for going on a decade now. And so there is some sign that the rapid growth that we saw in the early 2000s, mainly due to China's build out of coal plants, has slowed down at least, if not stopped. Going forward, and again, this is just math, this is not policy. If we are to keep that rate of decarbonization going on, we're going to have to start shutting down fossil fuel, mainly electricity generation. And I mentioned the coal-fired power plant is the lowest hanging fruit there. There's a lot of things that we have no idea how to replace, petrochemicals, plastics, fertilizer, and so on. So, my argument is, it's similar to the advancing human lifespan. In the 1920s, we had no idea how we were going to, Antibiotics weren't even discovered yet. We had no idea how we were going to advance public health in the year 2000. So my argument is, let's make sure we understand why that decarbonization rate has been a straight line, a downward sloping straight line for 50 years. And then figure out, well, what is it that we can do if we want to accelerate that? Again, while dramatically expanding access to energy services to people who need it around the world, whether it's rich folks like us in the United States who want data centers and AI, or it's people who are not yet on the grid in sub-Saharan Africa. So those are the questions that I think deserve much more of our attention, rather than did the global surface temperature go up by 1.5 degrees or 1.47 degrees or things like that.
Roger, if you were going to take a step back and on this report, because I've seen some of your analysis of it, and give us kind of your 2 or 3 things where you feel like the report is, accurate, well done, at least you agree with it, whatever you might say. And then the 2 or 3 areas where you would have some criticisms, where you'd say, I think this was overstated, or I disagree with this, or would you mind just kind of giving us a little bit of your pros and your cons? And I think I've seen you've assigned it a grade. At least I saw that, I think, somewhere. But maybe if you wouldn't mind just summing up the report like that.
As I start to talk about this, I have to declare a conflict of interest. I'm one of the most cited researchers in the report, so there are some sections that I will think they did a good job on. I should say, in the brouhaha, in the excitement that followed all the criticism of the report, none of the work I've been involved in with colleagues has been part of that criticism, which for me is, number one, it's telling, but it's also, there's some good stuff in there in the report that, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So for me, the endangerment finding that was produced originally under President Obama in 2009, that's getting to be a while ago. That's 16 years ago. And I've written about this. They relied on an outdated set of scenarios from even 10 years before that. It is, whatever happens with the endangerment finding, it would be important to update it, bring it up to date with the science of 2025 and 2026, and that includes the more modest projections of how climate's going to change just based on the scenarios alone. So the report is very strong on that. The report is also very strong on trends in extreme weather events in North America and the United States. Most people will be surprised to learn that, number one, yes, there have been increases in heat waves, especially since the 1960s. And in some areas, there have been increases in what's called extreme precipitation. But there have not been increases in hurricanes, floods, most metrics of drought, tornadoes. And so that's, the report's very strong on that, and it goes against, I would say, a narrative that's more common in the media than you will find, say, in the IPCC. The report, on the criticism side, the report gives more credence to projections of economic damage associated with changes in climate going forward. And I've mentioned this to Steve Koonin, who's one of the authors. It's fine if you want to criticize climate models for not being able to anticipate the future reliably to 2100, but you should probably extend that skepticism to economic models as well, because we're not very good at anticipating the economics. They talk a little bit about the benefits of carbon dioxide, like the greening of the planet, which is associated with more CO2. It helps with primary production of plants, and so the planet gets greener. That's fine, that's well and good, but any effort to try to evaluate the costs and benefits of future changes in climate and to argue, well, we think it's going to be on the benefit side, that's fine. They can do that under plausible assumptions, but so too can the other side with saying that it's going to have negative effects. So I guess the last thing I would say is the idea that this report, and I think the authors of the report to some degree, and also its critics, both kind of sign up for this, that this report is, the fate of the planet hinges on whether we accept this report or some other report, is a little overstated. I would just love for these authors to get in a room with their critics, talk it out, agree to disagree, find areas where they overlap, areas where they don't. It's not going to, if they did that, we'd wake up tomorrow and, there wouldn't be the apocalypse. People can talk. So I know Chris Wright, Secretary of Energy, and I don't have any inside information, but I suspect this came out of Department of Energy because this is kind of his pet project to try to open up discussions in climate science a bit. And so far, I think it's been even though people are gnashing their teeth, I think it's been useful and helpful. And it's also helpful for people on the sidelines to see, this is how adult scientists interact with each other. And it's pretty eye-opening. If you've been in the faculty room and faculty debates, you've seen these sort of things before, but most normal people don't have a chance to see experts kind of slinging mud at each other. And hopefully, let me just say, hopefully that leads to everybody raising their game a bit and increasing their standards of behavior. That would be a great outcome.
Well, that's a great thought. So you mentioned you were at the Abundance Conference last week. This week you're at the American Enterprise Institute get-together in Dallas. The abundance movement, I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking about that for a minute, because I think some of us kind of sort of think we understand what the messaging is there. It sort of sounds all of the above, and it's much more upbeat and positive than maybe some previous messages. How should we think about that? What does it really mean? What's the spirit of it? Is it a good thing? Is it a good thing that's so generic it doesn't mean too much? Like, how should we understand the abundance movement?
I went to the conference because I wanted to kind of suss it out, see what it's about. I'm not of the abundance movement. One of the organizations that's very close to the center is the Breakthrough Institute. My dear friends in San Francisco, I was a fellow there for 10 years, who have been arguing for a long time that the path to greater action on climate is through innovation. And they didn't use the word abundance, but the idea that more energy for more people is what matters. I posted on my Substack last week when I was going there that really abundance isn't new. The Republican campaign slogan in 1928, when Herbert Hoover was running for president, was a chicken in every pot. So that was abundance 1928. The abundance movement comes out of really people who are advocating for more housing, lower price housing, more abundance of places to live for people, particularly in urban areas. And it kind of morphed into something bigger. I have the sense that it is a reactionary response, particularly on the left, the center left, to progressives who have dominated democratic politics for a while now. And have an MO, I hate to say it, of shrinking the tent, of throwing out anyone who doesn't conform to a particular set of viewpoints. And we see this in climate also. Most encouraging thing for me being at the conference was the fact that there were Republicans there were Democrats there were elected members of Congress, elected people from the states, sharing the stage, talking, debating, agreeing, disagreeing. It just had a very nice vibe. I don't think it's going to go national and have an electoral influence, at least not as abundance. There was a couple members of Congress, one from Utah, one from New York, a Republican and a Democrat. And when they were talking, they very explicitly said, "I never use the word abundance in my district." And so for me, that was like, ding, all right, that's, but they do say, lower price energy, lower price food, less inflation, lower housing costs. And I do think that this is a movement that has captured elements of the center left and center right in a way that allows a discussion that, really hasn't been had. So I'll be following along, seeing where they go. But it for me, it was a worthwhile to kind of see what they're up to.
It is one way to understand it, Roger, is it's kind of a back to basics, whether you're center right or center left. It's like politics and governing should be about improving people's standards of living, regardless of the nature of the solution. Like let's get back to a chicken in every pot kind of thinking.
Yeah, very much. I heard the phrase, I don't know, it wasn't a million times, but it was close, that the abundance is about making people's lives better. It's not about consumption. It's not about more stuff. It's about providing making it easier for government to help provide things that people want, whether that's lower prices, better health, cleaner air, whatever it happens to be. And a lot of our politics, and there's no, I'm not breaking any secrets here, but a lot of our politics in 2025 is very symbolic, very much about what people are against than what they're for. And so if this represents kind of a moderating perspective on how we conduct politics in this country, it makes me pretty optimistic, because it's easy to get sucked into the vortex of partisan fights, but that's not going to put a chicken in anybody's pot.
And what's new at the American Enterprise Institute? What kind of things are you working on? Are they working on? What is that conference all about?
Yeah, so the American Enterprise Institute, I've been there as a senior fellow since the start of 2025. I have to say it's a fantastic organization. It is broad. It's nonpartisan. There's people with an enormous diversity of views. Next week in Washington, everybody's invited who's listening and wants to be there. I'm debating Ben Zeiker on the EPA endangerment issue. He's another AEI fellow. That's something that makes the organization special, is they encourage debate and discussion among their experts. They have 150, 180 policy scholars on all sorts of issue areas. I'm like a kid in a candy shop because I get to learn from the smartest people in the country on any given day. I'm part of a center they started up, kind of coincident with when I arrived, on technology, science, and energy, which I'm happy to see them in that space. And in the next weeks, they're going to be announcing a new center on the future of the American university, which is another topic very near and dear to my heart. And so AEI is one of those think tanks that's not affiliated with a political party or a candidate. And so you'll find scholars there who are extremely critical of the Trump tariffs. And you'll find scholars there who are supportive of Trump's energy policies. So it's think tank is a refreshing place to be for me. So I encourage people to check it out. It's got a lot of resources.
Well, I have one last one, and then I want to, Mike and Deborah, see if you guys have any last questions for Roger. But this is a big one, Roger. But in no particular order, Trump here recently talked about the, perhaps enforcing a law against burning the American flag. And I'm going to lump a bunch of stuff together here to try to make a decent question. The British, the UK seem to be, there's a story every other week about them struggling with what you might call free speech issues. I don't know, this is a gross generalization, but I think one reason why we enjoy you so much is at heart, number one, you're an advocate for free speech, open debate, open discussion, acting like adults. We love that. But yet there are these forces that want to limit dissent, I guess is what I'd say. What do you make of those forces? How should we understand them? I don't want to overstate them, but I'm sure there must be a trend that you sort of pay attention to at some level.
Yeah, I'll answer that in two ways. So one is that, fundamental to just basic liberal democracy is the idea that we all have the right to have our views and express them, and we shouldn't be sanctioned for them. And so part of that is what I think was Walter Lippmann called intellectual hospitality. We have to accept that none of us are omniscient, and others have good views, and even if we disagree, hearing them out is the path towards reaching agreement and finding common cause, and again, making all of our lives better. At another level, we have to recognize that democracy doesn't just run on citizens who vote; it runs on expertise and people with very specialized knowledge, whether it's energy or public health. And I think we've fallen into the trap on the left and on the right that politicians are picking their experts because of the views they find to be comfortable. And sometimes the most important role for experts is to say things that politicians don't welcome. And whether that's, on the origins of COVID or the reality of climate change or whatever it happens to be. And I do think that some of the illiberal behavior from politicians has turned against expertise. Not experts aren't innocent in all this, but we do have to figure out a way to create institutions where experts can call things like they see them in a way that sustains and builds public trust. Even if it's, on Tuesday, it might not be good for the Republicans. On Friday, it might not be good for the Democrats. But, we should be mature enough to understand that we really need experts to make things go.
Mike, Deborah, last thoughts from you guys?
One thing that I might just interested in your comments is, I think you wrote about this, to follow on your last discussion here, is the loss of trust in institutions. And one thing that surprised me a little bit, especially as you look at some of the climate science and research, whether it's how the models are put together, or I know there's a peer review process, which sort of is the gold standard as to what should be accepted. But there doesn't seem to be like what you would see with doctors, a Hippocratic oath, do no harm, or a clear transparency, disclosure of conflicts, decorum around what does professional conduct, misconduct look like. And do you see that might be something, not that I'm advocating for more professional regulation, but that might be something that we ought to think about to protect, not to regulate these institutions, but to protect that institution. So whether you're on the right or the left, if you speak your mind, you're not going to lose your funding. You're not going to lose your job. As long as you can back it up with, substantive research that you've done. And is there a need for something like that, not to overregulate, having come from an industry that's highly regulated?
Yeah, I've written a lot about this and thought a lot about this, and maybe there's a book in my future on this. But if you go back to the post-World War II era, there's a term that was coined by Vannevar Bush in his great report, Science: The Endless Frontier, about a social contract between federal government support of science and the citizens of this country. And the idea was that public is going to support scientists and engineers, and with the expectation that scientists and engineers are going to do work that benefits the public. And this, of course, extends, back to Abraham Lincoln and the Morrill Act with land-grant universities, and the hundreds of billions of dollars that have been invested in R&D in this country. I would argue that both sides of that social contract have kind of fallen short of their ideal. I won't go into the details, but it's pretty common knowledge that many universities have become deeply politicized on the left. And Republicans have taken advantage of that and pushed back against expertise. And I don't think there's any regulation or rules that can fix that. I think we need, what I tell my colleagues is, good luck. I can't control any politician who gets elected, who's in office, but I do know that we experts can control the institutions that we control. And we need stronger leadership to do a better job of explaining and acting in a way, we support all Americans. Doesn't matter if they're from Texas or Colorado or California or Florida. It doesn't matter if they wear a white shirt or a blue shirt. We experts exist to better the nation. Our institutions aren't here to become members of political parties or to advocate for this or that policy. If people want to, go into political advocacy, there's plenty of groups to do that. We don't need our universities and research labs to do that. So the most important thing I see is the need for better leadership, stronger leadership that controls the impulses that many people have to politicize the institutions. I can tell you, I'm lucky. I get to testify before Congress pretty regularly. I try to use that forum to speak to Republicans and Democrats. I try not to use that forum to be a champion for one side or the other, because they're calling me there as an expert, not as a partisan. And I think our universities need to kind of take that same approach, that they exist to serve everybody.
Roger, I was just thinking that's such a great quote. I've never heard someone say, "I'm lucky I get to testify in front of Congress frequently." That was awesome.
It is always an honor. I tell people, I know we're wrapping up, but early in my career, I got invited a lot by Democrats, later more by Republicans. And people ask me, how could you testify for this side? How could you testify for that side? And, the answer is I've had a career funded by the public. If they invite me, I'm going. It's an honor every time, and they can listen to me or not, but just having the opportunity to participate is pretty valuable.
Well, the spirit of your work and the quality of your work, it comes through in the comments, and it's why we always enjoy these visits and why we always want to get your opinion. Almost, you name the topic, we want to hear from Roger Pilkey. So thank you so much for spending this time with us. We'll attach a couple of the pieces you've written in The Honest Broker about this issue. We'll attach the DOE report. We'll attach Dr. Coonan had an editorial in today's Wall Street Journal. We'll attach that, and we'll be on the lookout for continuing to find ways to open up this discussion to more debate and more adult behavior, as you like to say, Roger.
I appreciate it, guys. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. See you soon, sir. Thank you.